She stood by the sink, hands deep in soap and water, humming softly at first. Then louder, her voice rising like it had a life of its own. The empty kitchen filled with something beautiful. But just as she hit the high note, the door slammed open. The manager stormed in, face red. "This isn't a concert hall," he shouted. Plates clattered as she turned, startled. "If you want to sing, find a stage. You're fired." She stood frozen, apron still tied, the song silenced mid-breath. And just like that, she was out. But what no one knew was that someone had been nearby, phone in hand, recording the whole thing. Not the yelling, the singing, a voice too raw to ignore. That video found its way to the right ears, and by morning, everything was different. A bell rang at her front door. She opened it to find a man in sunglasses, holding a business card. "I'm a producer," he said. "You're exactly what I've been looking for." Fired from the kitchen? Yes, but about to step into the spotlight. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Luna's Kitchen had been a fixture in the downtown district for 15 years, the kind of family restaurant that served comfort food to office workers and late-night diners who couldn't afford the trendy establishments that had sprung up around it. The building was old, with pipes that rattled and an air conditioning system that worked sporadically, but the food was honest and the prices were fair, which kept a steady stream of regular customers coming through the doors. Carmen Delgado had been working in Luna's Kitchen for 2 years, ever since she had moved to the city from a small town in New Mexico, where opportunities for young women were limited to teaching, nursing, or marriage to local men who had never traveled beyond the county line. She had come to the city with dreams of making it as a singer, carrying nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a guitar that had belonged to her grandfather. The reality of pursuing a music career in a city where thousands of talented people competed for a handful of opportunities had been harsher than Carmen had expected. Auditions were expensive and rare, requiring headshots and demo recordings that cost money she didn't have. Most of the venues that featured live music were looking for performers who could bring their own audiences or who had connections to industry professionals who could guarantee a certain level of success. Carmen had learned to survive by taking whatever work she could find while keeping her evenings free for the occasional open mic night or coffee shop performance that might lead to something bigger. Luna's Kitchen offered steady employment with flexible hours, and the owner, Mr. Ramirez, was understanding about letting her leave early when she had auditions or performances scheduled. The kitchen work was hard and thankless, involving long hours on her feet washing dishes, prepping vegetables, and cleaning equipment that never seemed to stay clean for more than a few minutes. But Carmen found ways to make the work bearable, singing quietly to herself while she worked, transforming the mundane tasks into something that felt connected to her artistic aspirations. Her voice was remarkable, though few people had ever heard it properly showcased. It carried the kind of emotional depth that came from understanding struggle, with a range and control that had been developed through years of singing in church choirs and high school productions. But in the city, remarkable voices were common. What mattered was having the right connections, the right look, and the right opportunities to be heard by people who could make careers happen. The other kitchen staff had grown accustomed to Carmen's quiet singing and found it pleasant background music for their work. The dishwashing station was in the back corner of the kitchen, far enough from the dining room that customers couldn't hear what was happening behind the scenes, and Carmen's voice added a warmth to the workspace that made the long shifts more pleasant for everyone. Mr. Ramirez had hired Carmen because she was reliable and hardworking, but he had come to appreciate her presence for reasons that went beyond her work ethic. She brought a positive energy to the kitchen that helped other employees get through difficult shifts, and her willingness to take on extra hours during busy periods had made her indispensable to the restaurant's operations. But Mr. Ramirez had been under increasing pressure from his business partner, Dave Morrison, who had invested money in the restaurant with expectations of returns that hadn't materialized as quickly as he had hoped. Morrison was a local businessman who owned several properties in the district and had little patience for what he saw as inefficiencies in the restaurant's operations. Morrison had been pushing for changes that would reduce labor costs and increase profitability, including eliminating staff positions, reducing wages, and implementing stricter controls over how employees spent their time during work hours. He viewed the restaurant as an investment rather than a community institution, and he had little interest in maintaining the family atmosphere that had made Luna's Kitchen popular with its regular customers. The tension between Mr. Ramirez's approach to running the restaurant and Morrison's business-focused demands had been building for months, creating an uncomfortable dynamic that affected everyone who worked there. Employees could sense that changes were coming, and the relaxed atmosphere that had made Luna's Kitchen a pleasant place to work was gradually being replaced by anxiety about job security and workplace policies. Carmen had tried to stay out of the conflicts between management, focusing on her work and saving money for the music career she was still determined to pursue. She had recently started recording demos in a friend's home studio, paying for studio time with tips she had saved over months of double shifts and weekend work. The evening shift on Thursday had been particularly busy, with a steady stream of customers that had kept the entire kitchen staff working at maximum capacity for 6 straight hours. Carmen had been washing dishes nonstop since 4 o'clock, her hands raw from the hot water and industrial soap that was necessary to keep up with the constant flow of plates, glasses, and cooking equipment. By 10 o'clock, the dining room had finally emptied and the other kitchen staff had finished their closing duties, leaving Carmen alone to finish the last load of dishes and clean the dishwashing station for the next day's shift. She was tired but not unhappy. The busy evening meant good tips for the servers, and she had been promised a share of the tip pool as a reward for staying late to help with the cleanup. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of running water and the gentle clatter of dishes being washed and stacked. Carmen found herself humming as she worked, a habit that helped her stay focused and made the repetitive task more enjoyable. The song that came to her was one she had been working on during her sparse free time, a melody that had been developing in her mind over several weeks of late-night guitar sessions in her tiny apartment. As she became more absorbed in the music, her humming grew stronger, eventually becoming soft singing that filled the empty kitchen with a sound so beautiful and pure that it seemed to transform the space itself. Her voice carried effortlessly through the large room, turning the industrial kitchen into something that felt almost sacred. The song she was singing was her own composition, a piece about finding hope in difficult circumstances, about holding on to dreams when everything around you suggests they're impossible to achieve. The lyrics spoke of small-town girls with big-city aspirations, of working multiple jobs while chasing opportunities that might never come, of believing in yourself when no one else believes in you. Carmen was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching the kitchen, didn't notice that someone had entered the restaurant through the back door and was standing in the shadows listening to her sing. She continued washing dishes while her voice soared through verses about perseverance and faith, about the strength that comes from refusing to give up on the things that matter most. The performance was spontaneous and unrehearsed, but it was also absolutely perfect. Carmen's voice moved through the melody with the kind of effortless control that comes from years of practice and natural talent, hitting notes that seemed impossible and conveying emotions that made the simple kitchen song feel like a concert hall performance. Dave Morrison had come to the restaurant to check on the day's receipts and make sure the closing procedures were being followed properly. He had been increasingly suspicious that employees were taking advantage of Mr. Ramirez's relaxed management style, and he wanted to document any infractions that would support his argument for implementing stricter workplace policies. When he heard singing coming from the kitchen, his first reaction was anger at what he perceived as an employee wasting time on personal activities instead of focusing on work. He approached the dishwashing station with the intention of catching Carmen in the act of goofing off, planning to use the incident as justification for implementing the disciplinary measures he had been advocating. But what he saw when he rounded the corner was Carmen working steadily through the mountain of dishes while singing with a voice so extraordinary that it stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he was caught between his anger at what he considered inappropriate workplace behavior and his amazement at the sheer beauty of what he was hearing. The conflict between these two reactions lasted only seconds before his business instincts took over and his anger returned with increased intensity. In his mind, Carmen was being paid to wash dishes, not to entertain herself with musical performances that had nothing to do with her job responsibilities. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Morrison's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, causing Carmen to spin around in shock and nearly drop the plate she had been washing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison," Carmen said quickly, understanding immediately that she was in trouble, but not entirely sure why. "I was just finishing the dishes." "You were just finishing the dishes?" Morrison repeated, his voice rising with each word. "It sounded to me like you were putting on a personal concert using company time and company facilities." Carmen felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. She had been working steadily the entire time, making good progress through the closing duties, and hadn't realized that singing while she worked would be considered a problem. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I was working the whole time. I can show you how much I've gotten done." But Morrison wasn't interested in evaluating her productivity. He was focused on what he saw as a fundamental lack of respect for workplace boundaries and professional behavior. "This isn't a concert hall," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is a business. You're here to work, not to entertain yourself with amateur-hour performances that distract you from doing your job properly." The criticism was harsh and public, delivered loudly enough that anyone else in the building would have heard every word. Carmen felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that her simple pleasure in singing while she worked was being treated as a serious infraction that could cost her the job she needed to survive. "I understand," she said quietly. "I won't sing while I'm working anymore." But Morrison had already decided that this incident represented a larger problem that required a more significant response. He had been looking for an excuse to demonstrate his authority and implement the stricter workplace policies he believed were necessary, and Carmen's singing had provided him with the perfect opportunity. "No," he said with finality. "You won't sing while you're working anymore because you won't be working here anymore. You're fired." Effective immediately, the words hit Carmen like physical blows, leaving her speechless and trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. In the space of a few minutes, she had gone from contentedly finishing her shift to losing the job that paid her rent and bought her groceries, all because she had found joy in her work by singing softly while washing dishes. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need this job. I promise it won't happen again." But Morrison was already walking away, satisfied with his demonstration of authority and convinced that he had solved a problem that would have only gotten worse if left unaddressed. "Pack your things and get out," he called over his shoulder. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." Carmen stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the dishes she had been washing and the silence that had replaced her singing, trying to understand how expressing joy through music had become grounds for termination from a job she had performed reliably for 2 years. What she didn't know was that her impromptu performance had been heard by someone else, someone who had been walking past the restaurant when her voice had drifted through an open window and stopped him in his tracks with its extraordinary beauty and emotional power. Marcus Rodriguez had been walking back to his car after a disappointing meeting with a potential client when he heard the singing coming from Luna's kitchen. As a music producer who had worked with some of the industry's biggest names, he had developed an ear for authentic talent that could cut through the manufactured polish of most commercial music. What he heard coming from the restaurant kitchen was the kind of voice that could sell millions of records, not because it was technically perfect, but because it carried genuine emotion and told stories that people needed to hear. He had stopped walking and moved closer to the building, trying to locate the source of the singing that had captured his attention so completely. Marcus had been in the music business for 20 years, long enough to become cynical about the industry's focus on image over substance, marketing over artistry. He had built his reputation by finding artists who brought authenticity to their music, singers who could connect with audiences through shared experiences and genuine emotion rather than manufactured personas and auto-tune perfection. The voice he was hearing from Luna's kitchen reminded him why he had gotten into music production in the first place. It carried the kind of raw honesty that couldn't be taught or manufactured, the emotional depth that came from understanding struggle and finding ways to transform pain into something beautiful. He had pulled out his phone and started recording, not with any specific plan, but with the instinct of someone who recognized that he was witnessing something special. The quality of the phone recording wasn't professional, but it captured enough of the performance to document what he was hearing. When the singing stopped abruptly, followed by raised voices and what sounded like a confrontation, Marcus had waited in the shadows near the restaurant's back door, hoping to speak with whoever had been singing. But when Carmen emerged 20 minutes later carrying a small bag of personal belongings and wiping tears from her eyes, he realized that something had gone seriously wrong. He had followed her at a distance as she walked to the bus stop, debating whether to approach her immediately or give her time to process whatever had just happened. The conversation he had overheard suggested that she had been fired, possibly for the same singing that had impressed him so much. Marcus had decided to give Carmen space to get home and recover from what was obviously a traumatic experience, but he had used the time to research her background. A few phone calls to contacts in the local music scene had yielded information about a young woman who performed occasionally at open mic nights, who had a reputation for exceptional talent, but had been unable to break through to larger opportunities. The next morning, Marcus had driven to Carmen's apartment building with a copy of the recording he had made and a contract that could change her life completely. He understood that approaching someone who had just lost her job might seem opportunistic, but he also knew that extraordinary talent deserved extraordinary opportunities, regardless of timing. Carmen's apartment was in a building that had seen better decades, with narrow hallways and thin walls that made privacy impossible. When Marcus knocked on her door at 9 o'clock in the morning, she answered still wearing the clothes she had worn to work the night before, her eyes red from crying and her voice hoarse from the emotional upheaval of losing her job. "Carmen Delgado?" Marcus asked, and when she nodded warily, he continued, "My name is Marcus Rodriguez. I'm a music producer, and I heard you singing last night at Luna's kitchen." Carmen's first reaction was confusion mixed with suspicion. She had learned to be careful about men who approached her with promises related to her singing, having encountered several people who used the music industry as a pretext for less professional intentions. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to close the door. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." "I'm not selling anything," Marcus said quickly, pulling out his business card and the contract he had brought with him. "I'm offering you a recording contract with Authentic Music Productions. I want to produce your first album." The words were so unexpected and impossible that Carmen couldn't process them immediately. She stared at Marcus as if he were speaking a foreign language, unable to bridge the gap between losing her dishwashing job 12 hours earlier and being offered a recording contract by a stranger at her door. "I think you have the wrong person," she said finally. "I'm not a professional singer. I just wash dishes and sing sometimes." Marcus smiled with the understanding of someone who had encountered many talented people who didn't recognize their own abilities. "Carmen, I've been in this business for 20 years. I've worked with Grammy winners and platinum artists. What I heard you singing last night was better than 90% of the music that gets played on the radio." He held up his phone and played the recording he had made, and Carmen heard her own voice filling the hallway with the song she had been singing while washing dishes. Hearing it played back, removed from the context of work and kitchen noise, she began to understand how her singing might sound to someone who wasn't accustomed to it. "You recorded me?" she asked, still trying to understand what was happening. "I did," Marcus admitted. "And I've already played it for 3 other producers and 2 record executives. They all want to meet you. They all want to sign you. But I got to you first." He opened the contract and showed her pages of legal language that outlined advances, royalty rates, and production budgets that represented more money than she had ever imagined having access to. "This is the standard contract we offer to new artists," Marcus explained. "But based on what I heard last night, I don't think you'll be a new artist for very long." Carmen looked at the contract with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust things that seemed too good to be true. The numbers on the pages were real, the legal language was specific and detailed, and Marcus's business card showed credentials that could be verified through simple internet searches. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Yesterday, I was washing dishes. Today you're offering me a recording contract. How does that happen?" Marcus leaned against the hallway wall with the relaxed posture of someone who had time to explain. "It happens because talent is rare, and authentic talent is even rarer. It happens because most of the music industry is focused on manufacturing stars instead of discovering artists. And it happens because sometimes the best singers are the ones washing dishes in restaurant kitchens, singing for themselves instead of for audiences." He gestured toward the contract in Carmen's hands. "The man who fired you last night did you the biggest favor of your life. If you had kept that job, I never would have heard you sing. You would have spent years saving money for demo recordings and paying for auditions that might never lead anywhere. Now you can skip all of that and go straight to making the kind of music that people need to hear." 6 months later, Carmen Delgado's debut album Kitchen Songs reached number 3 on the Billboard charts, driven by the success of the lead single Washing Away Dreams, which had been inspired by her experience singing while doing dishes at Luna's kitchen. The song resonated with millions of listeners who understood what it meant to work ordinary jobs while nurturing extraordinary dreams. The recording process had been unlike anything Carmen had expected, focused more on capturing the authentic emotion of her performances than on technical perfection or commercial appeal. Marcus had encouraged her to write songs based on her experiences as a working-class dreamer in a city that often seemed designed to crush such dreams, and the result was music that spoke to people who rarely heard their stories reflected in popular culture. The success had brought opportunities that Carmen couldn't have imagined when she was scrubbing dishes and saving tips to pay for studio time. She performed on television shows that she had only watched from her tiny apartment, gave interviews to magazines that she had read while waiting for buses, and traveled to cities that she had only dreamed of visiting. But perhaps the most satisfying moment had come when she returned to Luna's kitchen for a surprise visit during the restaurant's lunch rush. Mr. Ramirez had welcomed her with tears in his eyes, proud of her success and grateful that she had remembered the place where her musical journey had taken its crucial turn. Dave Morrison had also been there that day, awkwardly trying to congratulate her on achievements that had resulted from the termination he had imposed. Carmen had been gracious in accepting his awkward apology, understanding that holding grudges would only diminish the joy she found in her transformed circumstances. The conversation with Morrison had been brief but meaningful, providing Carmen with the opportunity to explain that she didn't blame him for his decision and that she understood he had been trying to run a business according to his best judgment. But she had also made it clear that his assumption about what constituted appropriate workplace behavior had been based on a narrow view of human nature and professional productivity. People bring their whole selves to work, she had told him gently. When you try to suppress the parts of people that make them human, you don't just hurt them. You hurt the workplace itself. The restaurant had thrived in the months following Carmen's rise to fame, with customers drawn by the story of the dishwasher who had become a recording star and the food that had sustained her during her struggling years. Mr. Ramirez had hired additional staff and improved working conditions, understanding that treating employees with dignity and respect created the kind of environment where extraordinary things could happen. Carmen had used her success to establish a foundation that provided financial support for aspiring musicians who worked service jobs while pursuing their artistic dreams. The foundation offered grants for recording equipment, studio time, and performance opportunities, helping to bridge the gap between talent and opportunity that had nearly derailed her own career. The scholarship program had attracted applications from hundreds of working musicians across the country, people who cleaned offices while writing songs, who waited tables while practicing instruments, who stocked shelves while composing lyrics that might someday change the world. Carmen reviewed each application personally, understanding the desperation and hope that motivated people to balance survival jobs with artistic aspirations. But the Foundation's work went beyond individual assistance to address systemic issues that made it difficult for working-class artists to develop their talents. Carmen had become an advocate for arts education in public schools, for workplace policies that recognized employees as complete human beings, and for cultural institutions that supported artists regardless of their economic backgrounds. Her second album, Second Chances, had been even more successful than her first, cementing her reputation as an artist who could transform personal experience into universal truth. The title track had become an anthem for people who had faced setbacks and disappointments, but had found ways to rebuild their lives around new opportunities. Marcus Rodriguez had remained her producer and had become a close friend, someone who understood that her success was meaningful not just because of the music she created, but because of the barriers she had broken down for other artists. Together, they had developed a production approach that prioritized authenticity over commercial formula, emotional truth over technical perfection. The music industry had taken notice of their methods, with other producers and record executives studying their approach to discover why Carmen's music connected with audiences in ways that more manufactured offerings often failed to achieve. The answer, Marcus insisted, was simple. People recognized honesty when they heard it, and they were hungry for music that reflected their real experiences rather than artificial fantasies. Carmen had never forgotten the evening when she had been fired for singing while washing dishes, not because it had been traumatic, but because it had been transformative. The incident had forced her to confront the possibility that her dreams might never be realized through conventional channels, which had made her more open to the extraordinary opportunity that Marcus had offered. She often spoke in interviews about the importance of finding joy in ordinary work, about the dignity that comes from doing any job well, and about the unpredictable ways that life can change when we remain true to ourselves even in difficult circumstances. Her story had inspired countless people to pursue their dreams while maintaining the practical responsibilities that kept them grounded in reality. The kitchen at Luna's restaurant had been renovated and modernized, but Mr. Ramirez had kept the dishwashing station where Carmen had sung exactly as it had been on the night she was fired. A small plaque near the sink read, "Where dreams begin," serving as a reminder that extraordinary things could happen in the most ordinary places when people had the courage to express their authentic selves. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disasters, and sometimes losing one opportunity creates space for possibilities we never could have imagined. Carmen's story reminds us that our talents and passions deserve expression regardless of where we find ourselves, that bringing our whole selves to whatever work we do can transform not just our own experience, but the experiences of everyone around us. The measure of a workplace, like the measure of a life, isn't found in rigid adherence to narrow definitions of appropriate behavior, but in the recognition that human beings are complex creatures who create their best work when they're allowed to be fully themselves. Because sometimes the person washing dishes is also the person whose voice can move millions of hearts. And sometimes the greatest performances happen not on concert stages, but in kitchen corners where dreams refuse to be silenced. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.